Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Filter, and I'm a project manager in the Office of Students and Young Consumers at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And today's presentation is on racial disparities in higher education. The Bureau's acting director, Dave Weggio, has given two priorities to the Bureau. The first is responding to COVID-19, and the second is exploring issues of racial equity within our purview. The Office of Students and Young Consumers began to look at the intersection of racial equity issues in higher education and how they impact the ability to grow wealth. This presentation is the first public work of our racial equity project to highlight some of the background data and research we have found as we begin our work. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a 21st century agency that helps consumer finance markets work by making rules more effective, by consistently and fairly enforcing those rules, and by empowering consumers to take more control over their economic lives. This presentation is being facilitated by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It is intended to generate discussion about student loans. The questions asked and topics discussed were developed in coordination with presenters and may not represent Bureau policy on any particular matter. Any opinions or views stated by presenters are the presenter's own and may not represent the Bureau's views. Nothing said in this symposium by a Bureau representative constitutes legal interpretation, guidance, or advice of the Bureau. Before jumping into the agenda, it's important to note that the intersectionality of race, sex and gender, and socioeconomic status has a compounding effect on the ability to successfully complete college and to move into the workforce and participate in the financial sector of our community. However, due to the significant amount of information that includes, this presentation is limited to focus on issues of racial equity as much as the impacts of race can be separated from those confluencing factors. So today we'll start with a review of the state of racial wealth in the United States and look at college enrollment and then completion, and then look at some post-completion outcomes such as income and then debt. The slide deck will end with a list of references used as resources for this presentation. According to research done by the Federal Reserve in 2020, the average Black family had accumulated wealth of $24,100, and the average Latino Hispanic family had wealth of $36,100, while the average white family had significantly more wealth accumulated, totaling $188,200. The Federal Reserve determined this came from two major areas. The first is lack of financial services inclusion, and the second is lack of educational inclusion, which is where this presentation will focus. The lack of financial services inclusion included required deposit minimums in bank accounts, the lack of geographic access to banks, and the lack of access to financial products such as loans and checking accounts. The lack of educational inclusion includes lower rates of post-secondary education enrollment, lower rates of college completion, and enrollment patterns at institutional types. Analysis of the Survey of Consumer Finances, a survey conducted by the Federal Reserve, showed that median white household wealth is 13 times the wealth of the median Black family and 10 times the wealth of the median Latino Hispanic family. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis also found that all states, with the exception of Wyoming, South Dakota, and New Hampshire, which did not have enough information to determine, have white median household incomes that are higher than Black median household incomes. While there are significant racial gaps, poverty rates for populations of color vary greatly, and nationally, Black households earn 61 cents for every dollar earned by white households. As you can see on this slide here, the darker the blue color, the greater the Black-white gap in median income. This map shows the gap for racial poverty by state. To determine this gap, analysts from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis took the percentage of Black households that were living in poverty and subtracted the percentage of white households living in poverty. As you can see, from states that they had enough data to make this determination, the vast majority of states have a significantly higher percentage of Black families living in poverty compared to white families. And similarly to the last slide, the darker the blue color, the greater the gap between Black and white families. And now to look at student loan borrowing at a snapshot. Overall, 45 million Americans owe a total of $1.7 trillion in student loans. This comes from three major loan programs. In the direct loan program, 35.9 million borrowers owe $1.3 trillion. Under the FEL program, 11 million borrowers owe $245.9 billion. And under the Perkins Loan Program, 2 million borrowers owe $5.7 billion. It's important to note that this amount has been increasing over time, with additional amounts being borrowed every year, and it's currently at an all-time high. Student loan debt is the second highest type of consumer debt, with the only other type of debt that Americans borrowing more than student loans is mortgage debt. Higher education has been seen, as the philosopher Horace Mann called it, a great equalizer, a force that could help level the economic disparities between people by providing them advanced opportunities to increase their earnings and wealth. A first step to that is enrolling in higher education. Here are some trends in enrollment. We know that Black and Latino and Hispanic college enrollment since 1980 has increased, but over the past decade has started to decline again. Overall, there is currently close parity between the percentage of students enrolled in higher education by race and their representation in the overall population. There are other factors that impact college entry by race. Non-white individuals also happen to be more likely to be low income and more likely to be first generation. Both of these groups tend to also have lower enrollments into higher education. Black students are more likely to enroll in for-profit institutions, community colleges, and less selective public institutions. These types of institutions have lower completion rates, and certain types of institutions, such as for-profit institutions, leave students with higher amounts of student loan debt, and students who attend these types of institutions are more likely to default on their student loans. And overall, representation by non-white populations has become more reflective of the overall population, but there's still work to be done. Achieving this parity is a start toward providing equal opportunity to non-white populations. However, extreme disparities still exist in college completion, debt borrowed, and post-enrollment outcomes. Here in this chart, you can see that the trends from 1990 to the present in college enrollment by race. As you can see, white enrollment has dropped a significant amount of the overall population, going from almost 80% to approximately 55% in 2018. Black and African American enrollment, Hispanic and Latin American enrollment, and Asian American enrollment have all relatively increased, and Native American and Alaska Native enrollment has stayed relatively similar from its original at 1990. It's also important to note that this data does not include the latest enrollment information on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on college enrollment, where all races saw a somewhat decline in their enrollment, and will be seen in the later slide. Here we see the college enrollment by race compared to their representation in the overall population of 18 to 24-year-olds in the country. As you can see, most races here have relative parity to their overall population, with at the most a 2.5% difference, as we see in the Hispanic and Latin American student population. But overall, in recent years, we've come to see closer parity between the two compared to what we were seeing in the previous slide in 1990. Here you see a further breakdown of enrollment by race and type of institution. As you can see, white enrollment is highest in the bottom section in public research universities compared to other races. Hispanic enrollment and Native American enrollment is highest in the community college sector compared to other races, as you can see in the middle section. And Black enrollment is highest in for-profit institutions compared to other races, as you can see in the top section. It's also important to understand how this will impact the amount of student debt that an individual has to borrow, or the amount that they have to pay in tuition, as the average tuition rate for four-year public institutions, that bottom section, is $8,200. For community colleges, the average tuition rate is $4,100. And for for-profit institutions at top, the average tuition is $16,000. So we can see here that there are certain groups, such as Black students, who are paying more for their college education solely by being more enrolled in for-profit institutions compared to those groups that are more enrolling in community colleges. The Georgetown University's Center on Education and the Workforce conducted a study of 2018 enrollments at selective public institutions and found that enrollment at these institutions for white students were significantly higher than the overall college-going population by about 10%. And conversely, enrollment for Black and African American students and Hispanic and Latin American students were significantly less than the college-going population. They believe these disparities come from the admissions pipelines, in which white students are more likely to be targeted as early as middle school to take the right classes and have the right counseling to get into these elite institutions. The policies of legacies, where an individual gets extra points on their admissions applications because a family member has already attended that institution. State enrollment policies that limit minority enrollment in institutions of higher education, and standardized test bias, in which white colloquial language benefits white test takers at the detriment of Black and African American students and Hispanic and Latin American students. Here we see the changes in enrollment during the pandemic that we've recently gone through. As you can see, all groups have had somewhat of a decrease in enrollment, but the largest amount that they've seen is with the Native American and Alaska Native students that has seen a 13% decrease in enrollment in higher education. And next, we'll move over to talk about issues with college completion. As you can see here with family financial support, 58% of Black students received financial support from their family. And of those students who received support, they received an average of $4,200 for their college education, while 72% of white students received financial support from their family. And of those students, they received an average of $12,000 from their family for college education. So as you can see here, white families already have additional financial supports to be able to provide help to younger generations attending college and limiting the need of those individuals to borrow student loans. Dr. Otto, who confirmed this research, stated that Black families had substantially less home equity and only half as much in financial assets as white families. While the research did not provide direct information about the reasons that families did not contribute, Dr. Otto speculates that Black families have fewer liquid assets such as stocks, bonds, and savings. And this slide gathers information from the IPED survey, which is housed at the National Center for Education Statistics at the Department of Education. This information is delineated to four-year degree-granting post-secondary institutions participating in the Title IV federal financial aid programs. It only includes first-time full-time students and does not include individuals who transferred institutions at any point. So as you can see here, there are both 4- and 6-year college graduation rates. The IPED survey gives full credit to institutions at 150% completion time, which for a 4-year program would be considered 6 years. So overall, you can see here that Asian American students and white students tend to have the best outcomes for graduation, reflecting more than the overall average. Below them slightly is Hispanic and Latin American students with a 55% 6-year completion rate. But at the very bottom of the completion rate pyramid, you can see that Black and African American students with a 39.8% graduation rate and a Native American Alaska Native students at 37.7% graduation rate are not completing college in the same levels as white and Asian students. And then here you can see what the 150% completion rate is by a further breakdown of sectors. As you can see, private four-year colleges and public four-year colleges have significantly higher completion rates than public two-year colleges, which are the community colleges, and for-profit four-year colleges. And as you can see from previous information that we've shared in this presentation, this can have a racial impact as well, as more white students are enrolling in the sectors that have higher completion rates, whereas Black, Native American, and Hispanic enrollments tend to be focused more on the four-year for-profit institutions and the public two-year colleges. So you can see how this will then impact when we couple the completion rate with the amount that an individual pays for tuition. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see the amount of debt that individuals take at a two-year program. So a 55% of individuals enrolled in a two-year for-profit college are borrowing more than $20,000 in student debt, compared to only 9% of individuals who attend community colleges. So you can see that those going to for-profit colleges, which we've seen before, tend to be more Black students, are coming out with more debt than those going to community colleges. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see the four-year programs, and you can see again, 78% of four-year for-profit colleges are graduating with $20,000 or more in debt, and that's only compared to 39% of students going to public colleges or 53% going to private nonprofit colleges. And then here you can see again a further breakdown of 150% graduation rate by institutional type and race. By and large, you can see in most sectors, white and Asian American students have better graduation rates than Native American, Alaska Native, and Black and African American students. And generally, Hispanic and Latino students fall somewhere in between those two groups. And now let's transition to our first look at post-completion outcomes by looking at the data that revolves around earnings. So here you see research done again through Georgetown University that looks at the median lifetime earnings based on credential earned. So you can see here that the more degrees that an individual has, the more likelihood they are to have increased earnings. You can see some of the changes here that if an individual, for instance, has a bachelor's degree, they're likely to have a median lifetime earnings of $2.3 million thereabouts, compared to someone who only has a high school diploma, who's more likely to be earning significantly less, with the median lifetime earnings of that group being $1.3 million. And obviously, going beyond a bachelor's degree increases his earnings even more, as you can see with master's, doctoral, and professional degrees, all earning substantially more than just the bachelor's degree. And then you can see this breakdown a little bit more by race for the groups separated either by having a high school diploma or a bachelor's degree. You can see that in both groups, white individuals are earning more than the same education level of Black and African American students and Hispanic and Latin American students. And then the increase that white individuals get by earning that bachelor's degree is significantly higher than the amount extra earned by Black and African American students and Hispanic and Latin American students. So not only are white students starting off in a stronger position with their earnings, but by completing a degree, they are also increasing their earnings more than non-white populations. And then here you can see a further breakdown by various education levels and race. The dotted red line that you see towards the right of all of the bar graphs is the earnings for white individuals at that degree level. So up until you get to the master's, doctoral, and professional level, you can see that white individuals in the workplace are earning more than all other non-white groups for the same education level. And only at the master's, doctoral, and professional levels do Asian Americans with the same degrees earn slightly more than white individuals at the same level. As you can see here, then African American and Latino borrowers are earning substantially less for the same education level as we saw in the previous slide. And then if you look also by sector, earnings 10 years after, you see the same things that we've been showing in the previous slides. On the left-hand side, you see, of course, the 2-year programs and what earnings are at 10 years after first enrolling, where an individual who goes to a for-profit college is going to be earning less at $28,700 compared to those individuals who enroll in a community college, who has a likelihood of earning about $32,700. And then on the right-hand side, you have the same comparison, but only for 4-year institutions, where an individual going to a 4-year for-profit college is likely to earn $38,700 compared to individuals in the 4-year public area who are earning $42,400. And some further explanations that might help explain some of these disparities. Job entrants of color may miss out on the social connections made at elite and private nonprofit institutions, which means that lower enrollment numbers at those institutions are hampering graduates and may push them into lower paying jobs. The college pipeline as early as middle school may impact college going behavior. Lower non-white enrollment in advanced high school and middle school coursework will leave those students with the wrong courses for application to elite schools. Overworked college counselors may not provide enough one-on-one counseling to help prepare students for the college application process. And students will have to rely on family, friends, and communities to understand the college application and financing processes. Non-white students will have less access to a knowledgeable community because of previous college enrollment rates. Additionally, once we talk about going into searching for jobs, the racial gap widens with resume quality. White job applicants with a higher quality resume receive a higher percentage of callbacks than Black job applicants with a higher quality resume. Discriminatory employment practices also hold back job applicants of color. Bertrand and Mulanathan found that Black applicants are twice as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts, earn 25% less. And perceptions of what race an applicant is by their name can reduce the likelihood of obtaining a job interview. Names that are perceived to be Black are 50% less likely to be given a job interview than those with perceived white names, even when the qualifications on the resume are exactly the same. And now let's transition to our final topic, looking at post-completion student loan debt. As we previously established at all levels of education, white earners made more than Black, Latino, and Native American wage earners. In fact, the only point where white earners are not the top of the education matrix were certain areas with high-level degrees where Asian earners out-earned white borrowers. So we know that non-white wage earners are bringing in less money regardless of educational levels. And here we see the amount of student loans borrowed by race. Specifically, what you can see here is that Black individuals who are already making less money at their jobs are more likely to borrow loans and more likely to borrow higher amounts than white and Asian individuals. At graduation, Black student loan borrowers have borrowed on average $7,400 more than their white counterparts. There's also a significantly higher percentage of Black and African American borrowers and Hispanic and Latin American borrowers who are on track to never repay their loans. 13.1% of Black and African American borrowers and 8.4% of Hispanic and Latin American borrowers are not on track to be able to repay their loans, compared to only 6.8% of white borrowers. 48% of Black borrowers owe more 4 years after graduation than they did at graduation. Now, to put that in perspective, that means after 4 years of payments on their loans, they are still owing more than they did at the time they started repayment. And that's compared to only 17% of white borrowers in the same situation. Deferment, forbearance, and income-driven repayment programs tend to be used by communities of color, which leads to greater balances being owed. Doctors Judith Scott Clayton and Doctors Jin Lee found that a quarter of the debt gap between white and Black borrowers comes from issues of difference in rates of repayment and interest accrual. Black graduates are more likely to see negative amortization occur on their accounts, which is when interest accumulates faster than payments are received. In income-driven repayment plans, oftentimes the established amount for repayment does not cover the interest, which leads to the growth of the loan's principal amount when the unpaid amount is capitalized. Similarly, when loans are in forbearance or unsubsidized loans are in deferment, loan interest continues to accrue on the loan, leaving a borrower with more money owed at the end of forbearance or deferment than when they began. Additional research by those researchers found that within 4 years of graduation, the debt gap between Black graduates and white graduates increased by 3 times overall. As we established, 4 years after graduation, 48% of Black graduates owed more than they did at graduation, compared to only 17% of white graduates. And Black graduates were more likely to default than white non-completers. So just to re-emphasize that, individuals who graduated and did everything they were supposed to, but are not receiving the same benefits based on their skin color, are more likely to default on their student loans than white individuals who did not complete college and are not receiving the benefits of the additional credential. At the 4-year mark, the average debt owed by Black graduates is $53,000, which is approximately twice as much as white graduate debt. And the debt gap between Black and white borrowers is more than $25,000. In her research, Dr. Judith Scott Clayton recommends 5 proposals to address the racial gaps in student debt post-graduation. She recommends 1, provide more support to borrowers to increase utilization of income-based repayment plans, which offers protections against the worst student debt outcomes, but does fail to account for the underlying causes of these race issues in student borrowing and default. 2, increase regulation of student loan servicers to ensure that they are providing high-quality, unbiased service to borrowers. 3, strengthen efforts to regulate for-profit institutions of higher education. 4, consider targeted student loan forgiveness to relieve borrower distress, focusing on populations that are most at risk. And 5, use existing federal data sources to provide better and more frequent data about student loan repayment patterns by race. When looking at loan repayment, Black borrowers are 2 times more likely than their white peers to fall behind on their student loan payments without accessing income-driven repayment. We know that 49% of Black borrowers and 46% of Latino borrowers have enrolled in an IDR plan, compared to only 39% of white borrowers who are doing the same. So as we just addressed the situation, those individuals who are enrolling in IDR plans may be seeing their overall amounts borrowed increase because they are not making enough to actually pay down that loan. Borrowers of color are more likely to fall behind on their student loan payments compared to their white counterparts. 30% of Black borrowers and 17% of Latino borrowers have fallen behind on at least one payment without enrolling in an IDR plan, compared to only 15% of white borrowers who are doing the same. Here you can see the overall default rate by race, and you see that Black and African American individuals and Hispanic and Latin American individuals have a significantly higher default rate compared to white and Asian American individuals. Of students who first enrolled in post-secondary education in 2003-2004, research done by Ben Miller found that half of Black student loan borrowers defaulted within 12 years, and Black borrowers were 3 times as likely to be in default within 12 years compared to white borrowers. Looking at a more recent cohort, one that started in 2011 and 12, 32% of Black and African American borrowers had defaulted, compared to 20% of Hispanic and Latin American borrowers, and only 13% of white borrowers had defaulted. When you further take this and look at default by college institutional type by sector, you can see again, as we've mentioned a number of times, that for-profit colleges have worse results with their students on a higher default rate compared to public colleges, which includes here community colleges, and private nonprofit colleges. To further break that down, here you can see for the 12-year default rates for all first-time students who started college in 2003 and 4, that for-profit colleges have a 47% default rate compared to only about 12 to 13% rate for public four-year colleges, not including community colleges, private nonprofit four-year colleges, and community colleges. So surely, as we've seen, for-profit colleges that have traditionally had higher tuition rates, higher borrowing, and are enrolling a larger percentage of non-white individuals also have the worst results here when it comes to looking at default rates on student loans. So as we've seen throughout this presentation, that higher education and the racial disparities in that field have some impact on the ability of individuals to grow wealth, and that there is a racial disparity component that does contribute to the racial wealth gap in America. While enrollment rates by race do have some current parity to the overall population, completion rates, loan debt, higher education cost, and earnings potential after graduation disproportionately negatively impact non-white individuals compared to the benefits that white individuals are receiving. And this does impact the current state of the racial wealth gap. The next few slides that we'll be going through are the sources used during this presentation. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Should you want more information with questions, comments, or to receive a copy of the slide deck, please feel free to email me. Again, my name is Scott Filter, and I'm a program manager in the section of students and young consumers. And my email address is scott.filter@cfpb.gov. Thank you all and have a great day.